Ladies and gentlemen, hello. It is such a pleasure to be with you. Thank you for the gift of your attention. I want to take you back to October 20th, 1968, specifically to the Mexico Olympics, where this happened. This might not seem like anything extraordinary, but the truth is, up until this moment, nobody had ever jumped like this. Everybody had either jumped like this, or like this. Nobody had ever tried it like this. What I love about this video is this woman, because she knows. She knows what she just witnessed. A great unlearning. In that moment, the entire sport was transformed by Richard Fosbury. Since that day, the only technique that has ever broken an Olympic record is the Fosbury flop. It is also the only technique that is taught today, because everybody started following Richard Fosbury. Now, my question for you is, what will your Fosbury moment look like? How will you bravely challenge the status quo? How will you stand the ridicule and despite it succeed? How will you move as if the gods whispered in your ears? Let me give you the example of Baltimore County with all of their 23 agencies, because they had their own Fosbury flop moment. At the beginning of the pandemic, they had 200 people, only 200 people working from home. Within 3 weeks, they needed to have 3,400 people working from home across all 23 agencies. At the beginning of the pandemic, they had 0 online transactions per day. Within 1 week, that number jumped to 500 daily online transactions. In fact, they are an Excella client, and my gratitude to Excella for putting this amazing conference together. What the Baltimore County story reminds me of is what we refer to as the agency opportunity North Star. Across every single agency that we have looked at, every single government agency that we have studied, we notice that these 4 areas are the biggest opportunities and also the biggest threats. But I want to focus on the opportunity side of this. Adaptability, technology, empowerment, security. To me, empowerment is about empowering citizens to lead better lives, empowering your staff to do more, empowering other agencies to do more with your help. And it's perhaps helpful to think of these 4 areas as 2 categories. Adaptability and technology are enablers. And I would argue that empowerment and security are the outcomes that we're all after. So with this North Star guiding our conversation, I want to jump into the big picture with you. If we zoom out, we should realize that we live in an amazing world. In the last 100 years, human life expectancy has more than doubled. Today, integrated circuits are more than 30,000 times faster than they were in the 1960s. Solar panels are more than 250 times cheaper since 1975. DNA sequencing is 100,000 times cheaper since 2001. We're seeing exponential growth in biotechnology, nanotechnology, and information technology. So when you hear me talk about exponential technologies, this is what I'm referring to. And what does this look like? Very clear. All of these devices from around 25 years ago fit in our pockets. And in fact, if you compare the technology that we carry in our pockets, the mobile technology, mobile phones, with the computer that put man on the moon, you're looking at 200,000 times the speed and 2 million times the memory. Neil Armstrong is not very impressed. But it's not just computers and mobile phones. 90% of all recorded data was created in the last 2 years alone. how much of this data are we tapping? Have we figured out privacy and security concerns around them? We're just scratching the surface with the help of AI. And medical knowledge, in another domain, medical knowledge is doubling every 80 days today. Doubling. Not going up by percentage points. Every 3 months, the volume of publications around medical journals, medical articles is doubling. Let me ask you this. Is your doctor keeping up with this? I don't think so. Now, speaking of biotechnology and the world of medicine, there are animals today in this world that have outlived their normal lifespan by more than 100%. This is the equivalent of you and I living to be 150 years old. This used to be science fiction. Now is beginning to be science fact. But let's keep going here. What about energy? Energy is interesting. Solar price per watt has been dropping exponentially. Number of panel installations has been growing exponentially. So in other words, solar is one of those rare technologies that seems to be growing double exponentially. Who does not understand this picture fully? The International Energy Agency. Every year they produce a report called the World Energy Outlook. And in this report, they're projecting the growth of solar technology. All the colored lines are the annual projections that are mentioned in the World Energy Outlook by the International Energy Agency. The black line is the actual growth in solar. In other words, these guys have been reliably wrong. In the last year or so, they have actually started to course correct. But the point is, they're not unique in their challenge of making sense of an exponential trend. The human brain has evolved over thousands of years to think linearly. Exponential trends are highly counterintuitive to us. Perhaps the best example of this is this gentleman, one of my heroes. Steve Sasson invented the digital camera while working, of all places, at Kodak. He's holding the device, more than 10 pounds, massively heavy device. And from the moment you press the button on this camera until it takes the picture, it would take around 23 seconds. So hold still for 23 seconds while I try to take the picture. What do you think happened when he showed up to the board of directors with his camera? They said, "Get out of here. This is a joke." Specifically, they said, "This is not the business we're in." You see, they thought they were in the paper and chemical business. But in reality, Kodak was in the memory capture business. And the digital camera technology that Steve invented was the very reason they ended up going bankrupt later. But at the time, they didn't see it. So a key question for all of us is, what business are we really in? What are we doing? What is our value proposition? Because that concept, as simple as it seems, is going to go through massive evolution in the next few years. But going back to Steve Sasson's story with the digital camera, compared to his camera technology, today's camera technology is 2,000 times the resolution, 1,000 times lighter, and 2,000 times cheaper. In other words, we're looking at a 4 billion-fold improvement. Ladies and gentlemen, let me ask you a question. If somebody shows up with a new technology, let's say my phone is a new technology, and I show it to you and I say, okay, this is version 1, it's going to get better, but this is going to change the world. Are you prepared to look at that new technology, version 1 of it, the worst it will ever be, and project it 4 billion-fold improved into the future? This is absolutely impossible for the human brain to imagine. And this is the challenge ahead of us because the pace of change is accelerating exponentially. And in fact, we think this decade will be remembered for 5 critical moments in human history. We call these the 5 supremacies, specifically quantum supremacy, blockchain supremacy, solar supremacy, biotech supremacy, and AI supremacy. Quantum supremacy is the moment when quantum computing becomes more powerful than digital computing. Blockchain supremacy refers to the moment when the blockchain architecture for a database becomes more useful than conventional databases. It's not about cryptocurrencies necessarily, although those are innovative as well. It's about the blockchain architecture for a database. Solar supremacy refers to the moment when solar energy, the marginal cost of solar energy, drops below all other forms of energy without government subsidies. And in many parts of the world, this is already happening. Biotech supremacy we define as the moment when more than half of the population believes the biology that we're born with is is no longer sufficient and they would like an upgrade. And finally, AI supremacy is when AI becomes more powerful than the human brain in the vast majority of business applications. We think these supremacies are going to happen in this decade. In fact, 2025 seems to be a convergence point. Why does this matter? Because we have looked across every industry we could find, and we have yet to find an industry, we have yet to find a domain where these dynamics do not apply. And yes, this applies to the private sector and the public sector. Production cost is going down. The marginal cost of producing one more unit of product or service is dropping in a very accelerating fashion. Ease of entry into new domains, new industries, competing with new players has never been as easy as it is today. Automation is on the rise thanks to robotics, thanks to artificial intelligence, and distribution cost is starting to drop as well because of self-driving vehicles, because of marginal cost of energy dropping so quickly. You combine all of these factors and it points to one picture, a pretty serious oversupply and consolidation scenario. And this matters because the translation is this. We will not need as many banks, retailers, theaters, factories, employees, cars, buildings, government agencies, etc. In other words, exponential technologies tend to create exponential winners and exponential losers. And this has massive implications for how we govern. Now, let's pause here for a second. You might say, I mean, you're talking about exponential technologies, but we all know 2020, the pandemic has kind of looked like this, right? It's been utter chaos. So many things have gone wrong, and it seems to go in cycles. We're nowhere near done. So the question is, what does this type of an episode look like when you think about its impact on technology? We have looked at this. We've gone back. In this particular case, I'm sharing with you what happens if you look at the evolution of price performance of computers, basically the growth of computational power. In the last 120 years, if we could even call those early machines computers, you notice that this chart, which is a logarithmic graph, captures a smooth curve, meaning there is absolutely no sign of the First World War, the Second World War, any famines, any pandemics, no social-political tension shows up on this chart, which really points to a picture of resilience when it comes to technological developments. I would argue we should go even further. My team and I, we've actually gone back and looked at similar episodes as the current pandemic, and we're convinced, as I'm sure you are as well, that crises tend to accelerate disruptive trends instead of slowing them down. Case in point, if you ask people today, who led the digital transformation of your organization? Was it the CEO? Was it the CTO? Was it the CIO? Or was it COVID-19? I think a lot of us would argue that COVID-19 was the biggest catalyst. Case in point, last year, Zoom became more valuable in terms of market capitalization than all of American-based airlines combined. Now, what do airlines do? They connect people. What does Zoom do? It connects people. So while the form of the business, the form of the value proposition will evolve and will be disrupted, the function tends to remain the same. Hence the importance of the question, what value are you delivering to the world? What business are you really in? And again, this applies not only to the private sector, but also to the public sector. Why does this matter? Because we've looked at hundreds of disruption stories out there, and the pattern we've noticed is highly consistent. For decades, nothing happens. And in weeks, decades happen. In other words, it's amazing, amazing, amazing until it's tragic. And people assume there would be enough time to respond to that final push, to that final movement caused by these tectonic shifts. In reality, there rarely is. By the way, last time I checked, Zoom is no longer a $50 billion company. It is a $100 billion company. So what could a post-pandemic world look like? If we look at history, if we search for lessons in this regard, we notice that there are 5 waves that tend to happen in this type of a crisis. The first 2 waves are debt crises and social unrest. If you think you've seen enough social unrest, think again. If history is our teacher, this is just the beginning. And debt crises are interesting. They're highly tragic, by the way, because governments and companies are trying to stay solvent, even individuals. Everybody's borrowing more, governments are printing a lot of money, and progressively the debt becomes unserviceable. You might have heard about the Evergrande debt situation out of China, where The whole concept of defaulting on $300 billion shook the markets. And that is just the beginning of debt progressively becoming unserviceable. We'll come back to this in just a second. But beyond social unrest and the debt crisis, which are the first two waves we noticed as we looked at similar episodes in history, the next two waves tend to be currency wars and trade wars. Right now, I would argue we're in the kumbaya phase of the pandemic. Every country is trying to collaborate. Everybody's trying to manage this crisis. And we're all very collaborative. But pretty soon, governments are going to realize that in the global arena, they are losing their competitiveness. That's when currency wars and trade wars gets going. That is how governments try to regain that competitiveness in the global international arena. And unfortunately, from there, we tend to see lots of hot wars. Hopefully this time around, it'll be different. Hopefully we can upgrade our collective imagination and avoid that type of conflict. But the reason the crisis, the pandemic, is so hard-hitting and so challenging right now has a lot to do with the impact of exponential technology. Specifically, I would argue the scene was set for the pandemic to have its maximal negative impact. We have yet to find a country that is prepared for this triangle. We call this the Intractable Trinity. The Intractable Trinity summarizes some of the macroeconomic impact of exponentially growing technologies. Pardon me. Technological deflation, commodity oversupply, and GDP compression. I won't get into a lot of the details, but very quickly, technological deflation refers to the fact that these technologies are making things cheaper, faster, and more accessible. Commodity oversupply refers to the fact that when the cost of resource extraction and transportation drops, as they will because of these technologies that we're talking about, there's a race to the bottom. Producers tend to overproduce because they're trying to capture that last stretch of profitability. And GDP compression is pretty straightforward. If you were to solve cancer, you will absolutely destroy global GDP. It's fantastic news for humanity. You're going to save a lot of lives. But the truth is, GDP was never designed to capture directionality. It's very poor at measuring progress. It is measuring momentum instead. So we need to upgrade the tools that we use. I've had the privileged opportunity to have one-on-one conversations with 10 presidents or prime ministers in the last 4 years. And let me tell you, not a single one has been prepared for this picture. Because what we're looking at here is the potential for a deflationary depression. And this will impact every one of your agencies. A deflationary depression, if you're wondering what that might look like, look at the case of Japan, the story of Japan and their lost decade. I'm simplifying it a little bit, but it tends to capture some key elements of the Intractable Trinity. Back in November 2020, I had an opportunity to have a conversation with Dr. Janet Yellen. You probably know Dr. Yellen as the former head of the Federal Reserve in the United States, the central bank of the United States. And this is just before she was appointed as a Treasury Secretary by the Biden administration. The topic of our conversation was the Intractable Trinity. And I'm pleased to report that Dr. Yellen is very much in tune with the human aspect, the human impact of this. And the reason I bring this up in our conversation right now is that it will affect everything that you guys will do. Specifically, the funding that you will have available is about to be disrupted potentially. Why is that? If you think about how countries, specifically central banks, are responding to the pandemic. This next slide gets a little technical, but bear with me. Here's how they've been responding. Yeah, highly technical. They've been printing a ton of money. The European Central Bank, the ECB, the Fed, Bank of Japan, everybody has been printing a lot of money as governments try to stay solvent, as governments try to keep our economies going. This sounds great on the surface, but in reality, consider this. There's a measure called the M1 monetary base. It measures the volume of a certain currency in circulation. For the dollar, last time I checked, it was $5.7 trillion. That's the M1 base for the dollar. Now consider this. Of that amount, 44.9% is what we saw last year as newly created dollars. Almost half of the dollars in the M1 base were created last year. This tends to cause issues. On one hand, we're trying to create healthy, quote unquote, inflation, but in reality, technological deflation and all these other factors are not leading to the inflation of the type that central banks are looking for. They lead to asset price inflation. Specifically, if you look at the Dow Jones Industrial Average, I take issue with the fact that these two charts look so similar, the COVID chart and the Dow Jones Industrial Average. In other words, that money is going into a different asset class and is creating this type of bubble dynamic. Now, this matters because the funding that you have, the resources that you have available, need to be treated as urgent and potentially scarce. That's the whole point around this conversation, for us to move with urgency. I want to share with you the story of one specific area of technological development, the million-mile battery. You probably heard the announcement last year by electric vehicle companies, including Tesla, that now we have the million-mile battery. What this means is, after 10 users, 10 owners of the vehicle have changed hands, they've passed on the same car to the next owner, next owner, next owner, 10 times, you still have a battery that does not need to be changed. It's unbelievable, the quality that these batteries have today. And in fact, they can be charged for 400 miles or 640 kilometers per charge. And they also have 20 moving parts. These vehicles are pretty remarkable in that they only have 20 moving parts instead of the 10,000 that you find in a typical gasoline car. And what that means is the car is not going to break down as frequently. There are fewer moving parts. Let's think about the implications of this one technology. In terms of price will go down, again, because the marginal cost of production is dropping rapidly. Access to this technology will go up, because as these cars start to drive themselves and you can summon them whenever you need to, then why would you own? You can actually simply access the vehicle whenever you need it. So we think, as we've seen in other domains, a shift away from ownership towards access is right around the corner. Number of accidents will go down. This means that we will not need as many repair shops, and fewer people will die and fewer people will actually get hurt. Cars will not into other cars, walls, trees, you name it. And the health of society, of course, the health of these vehicles will go up as well, which means we don't need to produce as many cars. Fewer people are owning them because everybody is choosing access instead of ownership. Utilization rates for normal vehicles is below 10% average utilization rate. That car is sitting in your garage more than 90% of the time doing nothing. So you combine these factors, and I want to encourage you to think about the North Star model. How would your agency provide security and transparency when adapting to this technological change? Let me tell you, this piece really surprises people. Around 3% of global GDP comes from the death and destruction of car accidents. Think about that. It's tragic, and it will absolutely go away when these cars are going to drive themselves. How would you respond to this and other shocks, expected or unexpected, that would come from this particular technology? The message, though, that I really want to emphasize is the following. Today's agencies have more agency. Yes, that's true. I want you to feel empowered, not disabled with all of these technological changes. These changes should be absolutely encouraging. Why? Here's why. Because of technological empowerment. What we're noticing today is that people seem to be doing what companies used to do, and companies seem to be doing what governments used to do. There is this cascading effect of technological empowerment. And the question is, what are governments doing? I think governments can be doing much more, but one particular area that they're really focused on right now is the fact that governments have to compete with each other for the first time like companies do. And this is driven by digitization and mobility. The fact that now governments of all levels need to compete for talent and compete for capital. Case in point, 22% of Americans have either relocated due to COVID or know someone who has. If you zoom into Silicon Valley, this number jumps to 80%. So again, digitization and mobility are creating massively disruptive dynamics for governments and agencies of all levels. What do people want? What is driving this behavior? Ultimately, we can summarize it as follows. Tax incentives, ease of work, and quality of life. Pretty straightforward. To add a little bit more color, tax incentives come down to personal and corporate, resident and non-resident, ease of work, digital government, legal ease, and opportunity to innovate with safety. Quality of life refers to cultural safety, financial security, healthcare, all the standard stuff. Which brings us to this video.
I'm not afraid of you, City Hall. Let's do this.
This video summarizes what I would call the great governance disconnect. What's happening? What is going on? We're seeing this all around the world with agencies focused on any range of issues. There are 5 dynamics going on right now leading to the great governance disconnect. Number 1 is that people, our citizens, our constituents expect extreme agility and efficiency from government agencies. They also want lower taxes and service fees. Okay. They want thoughtful deregulation. They expect government to thoughtfully get out of the way, not to interrupt innovation. But at the same time, they demand safety and transparency, right? At the end of the day, that's what they want us to do. And finally, they want user-friendly services. So you combine these factors. Of course, the governance disconnect becomes very, very obvious. It seems impossible to do all 5, to deliver on these massive expectations. But I want to remind us on what Nelson Mandela said. He said, "It is always impossible until it is done." It is always impossible until it is done. Powerful words. And basically what it does is it reminds me that next time you're trying to enter your vehicle, consider the Fosbury flop. But on a serious note, if we want to think about technological empowerment, like I said, people are doing what companies used to do, companies are doing what governments used to do. In order to envision a future-ready government, a future-ready agency, we actually need to look to the left. We need to understand what else is happening in the world when it comes to companies, organizations, people. And from there, we can actually have very actionable insights. So, without further ado, I want to share with you 7 strategies for adaptive governance in an exponential world. And I want to begin with a personal anecdote. I run a startup launchpad. These are all our own ideas. These are basically self-funded projects. My wife and I decided to put all of our life savings into projects that we care about. Some of these include stage 0 detection of cancer, for example. We have a research program around this because if you detect cancer that early, you actually create a mechanism for people not to die from cancer. They tend to not die from cancer because survival rates shoot up if you detect early. That's the type of project we do, and we launch startups from T-Labs, my company. Now, a while ago, we decided to look at every example of an organization that had grown exponentially in the last 2 decades. The idea here was that we wanted to learn from these companies and adopt their strategies. And in the course of looking at more than 300 businesses that have grown exponentially in the last 2 decades, we noticed very consistent patterns. This is how the exponential business models framework was born. Initially, this was just for ourselves, but we decided to share it with the world. I've done entire talks on this because people kept asking us about it. Right now, though, I want to share with you one key concept that was incredibly consistent in these 300 businesses that we looked at. Virtually every single one had leveraged the power of the digital twin. What is a digital twin? A digital twin is simply a digital representation of people, property, or processes. In other words, look around yourself. Think about your agency. Think about all the people you interact with, all the properties you interact with, all the processes you follow. And ask yourself, do they have a digital twin, a digital representation? If not, go ahead and capture that. And recognize that you might be sitting on top of an exponential business model. It turns out this triangle explains the vast majority of disruption stories out there that we've looked at. Each one is about somebody figuring out how to use a new digital twin to deliver more value. Because the moment you have a digital representation of people, property, or processes, you can apply all of these exponentially growing technologies to unleash exponential value. This is how exponential business models are born. I want to share with you a concrete example of this so we drive the message home. Let's try this together. What if we could create a nearly perfect digital twin of a bicycle accident? What if we could look at thousands of bicycle accidents and create that digital twin, that digital representation of the physical process of a person falling from a bicycle? Well, this is exactly what a company out of Sweden did. And here's what they came up with. This airbag takes 1/10 of a second to inflate. Now, you might be wondering, is this safer than a bicycle helmet? Not only is it safer, it's in fact 8 times safer than a bicycle helmet. If you're in a bicycle accident wearing a regular helmet and there's head impact in the accident, you're 90% likely to end up with head trauma with a regular helmet. With hoofding, this airbag I just showed you, it drops to 2%, from 90% to 2%. That's the power of digital twinning. The moment you have the digital twin, you can use AI, inflate the bag super fast, and the rest is history. In fact, the vast majority of innovation stories you hear about from Silicon Valley are also digital twin innovation stories. Uber created the digital twin for cars and people. Airbnb created the digital twin for homes and availability. Facebook created the digital twin for your social network. Yelp created the digital twin for public opinion. Fitbit, the digital twin for physical activity. Slack, the digital twin for team conversations. Again, digital twinning is at the core of these innovations. What about the public sector? I want to bring your attention to the story of Incheon, South Korea, the third largest city in South Korea. This city has wonderfully over-indexed on digital twinning, and they're seeing fantastic results. Specifically, they're starting with 6 areas: traffic, fire response, sanitation, development, facilities management, and revitalization. Basically, these digital twins are providing a real-time mirror of the city, and this allows for accurate predictions and just-in-time response. But perhaps the best example of digital twinning that has already created outcomes that people are grateful for, citizens are enjoying, is the story of Estonia. And I want to show you this video. Have a look.
Hello, I'm Tina. I live in a digital society of Estonia. I use my electronic ID card to access public and private services online, like filing my taxes and checking my son's progress in school. My husband has used his card to register his new business, my father to apply for a farming subsidy, and my mother to view her health records at home. And I can pick up her medications using my card. So our lives have become so much easier.
This is not the future, but already everyday life for our 1.3 million residents in Estonia. Our advanced digital society offers services in many fields like health, education, voting, and so on. And all these services make life easier, more convenient, more efficient for everybody. Our national information system is built on X-Road technology, which connects together data from all parts of government as well as with the private sector. X-Road safeguards information to protect integrity and privacy, but at the same time it is very easy to add new services.
The key building block in the success story of Estonia is the fact that they managed to create a digital twin of identity for each citizen. And I would argue that's the place to start. In one study we did for the government of Greece, our research team concluded that digital twinning could actually save 14,000 working years every year in that country. Because the moment you have digital twinning, again, you can apply these technologies, including artificial intelligence. The question of how much can a government save from artificial intelligence is just an example of this. And Deloitte did a fantastic job answering this question for the United States government. There are 2 categories they came up with: high investment in AI and low investment in AI. These are investments, both of them, in categories of AI where AI is helping automate processes that are already happening, but this technology exists today. This is not about waiting for an AI breakthrough. Using current AI automation technology, even with a low level of investment, they estimated that the US government could save $3.3 billion every year. With a higher investment, $41 billion. And this brings us to the following observation. We noticed that you could project the future of any product or service by looking at it through the following lens. You want to ask yourself 3 basic questions about any product or service, including those offered by agencies. Number 1, ask yourself whether the virtual digital connected version of that product or service exists. If not, go ahead and build it. That's a massive source of value. We're also noticing the Uberization of many different industries and products and services. The fact that people want what they want exactly when they want it. Just-in-time delivery is a huge source of value. And finally, because the marginal cost of production, the marginal cost of producing one more unit of product or service is dropping exponentially, it doesn't cost as much to hyper-customize your value proposition. That means you can go after the long tail of the market and have a unique value proposition to each individual. Which brings us to the following question. Do you believe the Earth revolves around the sun? Hopefully you all do. But consider this, for thousands of years, this was the accepted model. Everybody believed the sun and all the planets revolved around the Earth. Of course, what we know today is that the moment you put the sun back at the center, the model becomes very elegant, it becomes simple, it becomes mathematically tractable. The sun in this analogy is the customer. Too many industries have gotten used to the idea that they are the center of the universe. But the truth is, disruptors show up and they put the customer back at the center. And everything changes. I would argue this has to be the guiding principle for agencies as well. How do you put the customer back at the center? How do you disrupt yourself? The way to do it, and this is exactly how we think about every startup we try to create, is number one, to realize that the customer is very busy. She's juggling too many things. So you want to think about your value proposition as 10 times faster, 10 times cheaper, 10 times easier to use, 10 times more predictive. These are not exaggerations. This is literally how we start every single project. We take a value proposition and we try to imagine it tenfold improved across the board. In other words, you want to be more like Amazon and Google before it is too late. Now, this concept of putting the customer back at the center, I was delighted to find it at the core of a recent KPMG report on the future of local government. Highly recommended. The headline here is that their belief is personalized government services is the future. And similar to our conversation, they're recommending starting with that digital identity because it triggers, it enables the vast majority of these types of innovation scenarios that we're talking about. But this is the world outside. This is how we treat our customers, our citizens. What does the world inside look like when you do all of this? What does teamwork look like? Let me show you.
But Holland comes in for a pit stop. Time to refuel and change tires. Lou Moore himself changes the tires. Only 4 crew members, including the driver, are allowed to work on the car. It's a tense time. Holland stays in his seat, anxious to get away. Let's watch. Tires are changed at last. A crewman polishes the windshield as Holland moves away just 67 seconds after he stopped.
Just 67 seconds after he stopped. More like a year after he stopped. This is the world record right now, 1.92 seconds. So we have looked at systems that behave like this. And we noticed 3 key patterns, 3 consistent patterns. We had a different acronym for it. Our marketing department didn't like it. But SAS, system dynamics. These are systems that are highly adaptable, highly scalable, and highly self-manageable. Adaptability we'll talk about in just a second. But scalability. Notice that if you wanted 10 pit stops instead of the one you see here, you can replicate the same system anywhere, bring the right people in, and they'll know exactly what to do. It's infinitely scalable. The system is self-contained. Also, notice there are no managers in this picture. Everybody is managing themselves, which means they can respond to change in real time. But there's something else going on here, and this is a very consistent picture that we discovered as we looked at many different teams. Notice in this picture, nobody is collaborating. Instead, everybody is hyper-coordinated. Collaboration is let's get together and figure out how we're doing this. Coordination is we know what we're doing. Let's synchronize what we're doing. Now, this runs in the face of 80 years of modern management science that says, oh, we have to all collaborate perfectly all the time. In fact, the volume of collaboration activities in the last 20 years that we demand of our employees, private and public sector, have gone up by 80%. 80%. Consider this. When you ask people anonymously, 76% of us report preferring to work alone than working in a team. 76%, 3/4. But this is only if you ask anonymously. If you ask publicly, they're going to say, no, I love teamwork. I'm a natural born team player. But when we ask anonymously, more than 3/4 of us prefer to work alone. Why? Because of collaboration fatigue. Collaboration comes with a lot of friction. And as the world outside the organization is changing faster and faster, collaboration fatigue is increasing ever more exponentially. The solution is coordination. Let me be very clear. I'm not saying let's get rid of collaboration. I'm saying in every organization we've looked at, this is the picture. The vast majority of organizations have most processes as collaborative. There's a little bit of coordination. I'm encouraging us to go to this picture where the vast majority of processes are coordinated. There's a little bit of collaboration left for things that can only be done collaboratively. Because the system on the left is fragile, the system on the right is anti-fragile. It responds elegantly to external shocks. This theme of collaboration and coordination will dominate, I believe, the way we scale our teams, we skill and upskill our teams, but also the way we adopt technology at the agency level. Collaboration versus coordination. So let's double click and go a little deeper. Let me show you collaboration. This is San Francisco in 1906. The automobile has just been invented, and what we have here is a group of people collaborating not to die. It's utter chaos. We have horses, people, bicycles, cars, carts, all sorts of stuff. People are literally collaborating to stay alive. Now contrast this picture with what we have today. In this picture, nobody is collaborating. In fact, when accidents do happen, it's because somebody got cute and they tried to collaborate. If we stick to the rules, we're good, my friend. Now, what is allowing this system to shift from collaboration to coordination? It's right in front of us. It's the traffic light. We call the traffic light an exponential operating system. Why did we suddenly need a traffic light? Here's why. Between the year 1900 and 1920, the number of cars on public roads went from 8,000 to 8 million. Talk about exponential growth. Suddenly, collaboration was no longer feasible. So right in the middle of that period in 1910, somebody invents the traffic light. And by 1920, the vast majority of major cities in the world have a traffic light. But this is not unique to traffic. This is something we see again and again. As the complexity of a system goes up, we start to leave the collaboration zone because collaboration becomes less and less feasible and we have to enter the coordination zone. This is why somebody shows up and invents an exponential operating system and the system can keep growing. I would argue, if you think about Henry Ford, Thomas Edison, Steve Jobs, these guys were very good at building these operating systems. And in fact, when you think about what Google has done, the App Store, the concept of a blockchain, these are also operating systems. I would argue that Excella is also an operating system. The point is the complexity of all the solutions you need to integrate is so high and increasing so rapidly that it behooves us to think about an operating system approach that enables an entire portfolio of solutions instead of individual solutions and trying to figure out how to make them collaborate with each other. And this brings us to a critical concept. What we have noticed is that markets are no longer demanding products or services. They're demanding performance. Aha. What does this look like? Let me give you a concrete example. Let's say you're the owner of a theater company in Spain. At your theater, every night you run comedy shows. Business is great. People keep showing up. They watch comedy shows. They love it. And you're making a lot of money. One morning you wake up and you notice this headline in the newspaper. The government has just increased the tax rate on theatrical shows from 8 to 21%. They have tripled the tax rate on you. Translation? Nobody's going to show up. What would you do? How would you, as the theater owner, respond to this external shock? I want you to think about it for 10 seconds, and then I'll show you what these guys actually did. Think along the lines of selling performance and also utilizing digital twinning. All right, here we go.
Pay per laugh, the first comedy shows where you only pay for what you consume. We fitted each seat with a facial recognition system that detects the smile and proposed the following deal to spectators. Entrance will be totally free. If the show produces no laughs, you don't pay anything. However, if you laugh, you have to pay for each smile. Each smile produced is worth 30 euro cents, something that in this day and age is quite a reasonable price. At the end of the show, the spectator could check their laughter account before paying and even share it on social networks. And so that no one would cry for having laughed more than they could afford, the maximum amount to pay was 80 laughs for 24 euros. The average price of the ticket increased by 6 euros. The system was covered by the main national media outlets, and this produced 35% more spectators. Each pay-per-laugh show produced 28,000 euros more ticket money than was normally taken. Currently, the system is being copied in other theatres in Spain. A mobile phone app was created as a system of payment, and the first season ticket was launched for the number of laughs, not show.
If you're going to a comedy show, what is your biggest risk? What if it's not funny? That's exactly what these guys de-risked. So I think the question for all of us is the following. What is your pay-per-laugh business model? Let me tell you, usually we tend to think of the 10% strategies, process improvement, cost reduction, digitization, all important things. But the 10x approach involves unlearning. We need to unlearn previous models, previous things that used to be successful for us or good enough. And we need to embrace a new, completely new approach. Because even if we don't, the market will. Case in point, Amtrak. You probably know Amtrak, otherwise known as the National Railroad Passenger Corporation. Amtrak operates passenger trains across the United States. So when you run a train service, what performance are you promising, really? On-time arrival, right? Amtrak, of course, doesn't guarantee this. They don't have a pay-per-laugh model. But if you're delayed, a company called DoNotPay.com will actually fight Amtrak on your behalf and get you money. They consider themselves the world's first robot lawyer. Fascinating story. DoNotPay.com, check it out. And all of this, so the point is, you want to discover your own pay-per-laugh model, because if not, the market will still demand it. The market will be dissatisfied, and occasionally somebody will come around and force you in that direction. But all of this conversation around the pace of change and the evolution of our value proposition also brings into sharper focus the question of what not to invest in. We currently have massive opportunities for agencies due to things like the ARPA funds to actually invest heavily. Lots of governments around the world are noticing that they need to invest to navigate the pandemic. In the case of Delaware, they decided to use a $120 million budget from their ARPA funds to connect residents, basically homes that lacked wired connectivity, broadband service, would now be connected. Now, this seems fantastic, except consider this. There are no less than 7 internet from above companies that are working on delivering internet from the space. And in fact, commercial availability for the vast majority of them starts in 2022. Starlink satellite internet from SpaceX already has 90,000 users, and it's broadband speed. So it's as much about where to invest and also where not to invest. Another example is if you're building major roads, major road improvement projects, building new parkings, anything along these lines, consider eVTOLs, electric vertical takeoff and landing, drones basically. These technologies are right around the corner. Commercial availability is projected to be in 2023, about a year from now, for 3D mobility. This is a new revolution, the revolution in 3D mobility, and it will translate into orders of magnitude cost reduction. So the market will move in this direction because it's more efficient, it's more cost effective, not because somebody is pushing the technology. And in fact, it goes all the way to autonomous cargo drones. So if you're considering a new port project, maybe don't rush into it. The point is to look broadly, look all around, think about where the puck is headed and where some of these investments might no longer make perfect sense because the pace of change is accelerating. Exponential change is what we're looking at. But here's something else we know. The pace of human adaptability is only increasing linearly. And this is where we are. This causes problems. In times of chaos, high volatility, what do? We surround ourselves with intelligent people. We try to build smart teams. But recent research has shown that beyond the first 2 years on the job, IQ does not seem to predict success anymore. It used to, but not anymore. So what are we missing? Along with my wife, who's my co-founder, and a group of researchers, we have come up with the concept of AQ for the Adaptability Quotient. The point here is that if the pace of change is accelerating, then your ability to respond to that change is the strongest predictor of your success. And up until our research program got going around 7 years ago, nobody had actually quantified adaptability. Psychologists would say, no, it's too fluid, we can't measure it. I believe you cannot manage what you don't measure. So we created this research program to measure AQ, to measure adaptability. And while we thought we were measuring one thing, we realized over the course of these 7 years that there are in fact 10 dimensions that define how well you can respond to change. And through our academic partners, what we now know today is that AQ predicts job performance, job satisfaction, and even life satisfaction. Some examples. If you have high cognitive adaptability, this is where you can multitask and context switch in times of change. You're 64% more likely to easily adapt to project changes. If you have high adaptive receptivity, openness to new ideas, you're 39% more likely to innovate with insufficient resources. If you have unlimited resources, anybody can innovate. The challenge of innovation is how do you innovate with insufficient resources? And high adaptive receptivity tends to help a ton. If you have high rational adaptability, you're 80% more likely to work well with others and handle conflict effectively. Which brings us to a critical point. What we discovered in our research is that unlike IQ, AQ, the adaptability quotient, is not fixed. It seems to be highly coachable, which is fantastic news for humanity. It means that it's not a label we give people, but actually a baseline we measure, and it's a compass for how to grow. This is why we started Adaptability University, adaptability.org. And we've had the privileged opportunity to serve a number of public and private sector organizations all around the world. Our anchor program is AQ Boost, where you get to measure and boost your adaptability and your team's adaptability. So it is my pleasure to announce that Excella has actually sponsored 25 seats to the AQ Boost program for all of you guys who want to participate. I'll share with you at the end of the program how you can grab one of those seats. Typically, these are $2,500 per seat, but Excella has sponsored 25 seats, fully complimentary. One of the key concepts that has emerged in our research into AQ is the following. We're noticing that you can look at any organization today and divide the workforce into two groups. What we call trilinguals versus everybody else. This pattern had started way before the pandemic, but the pandemic has certainly accelerated it. Who are trilinguals? Trilinguals is a term we came up with to refer to individuals who speak 3 languages. What languages are they? Number 1, the language of adaptability and agility. The pace of change is accelerating, and decision-making under uncertainty is the name of the game. That's the first language that trilinguals speak. The second language is the language of technology and AI. The point is not for every person to have to create AI, to have to write code. That's not the point. The point is for us to know where technology is headed so we can ask better questions. And of course, there are technical teams who can help with developing that technology. And the third language they speak is the language of work and purpose. Notice the language of the job is the third language, not the first 2. The reason is when you have high AQ, when you have an understanding of technology, you can navigate different jobs much more comfortably, and you can context switch, you can go between jobs much more effectively. In the organizations we work with, we help them find trilinguals and develop their current workforce into trilinguals. A lot of organizations have highly capable individuals and perhaps an aging population, but they need to realize, leaders are realizing that to boost adaptability and agility, to unlearn some of the old ways is now the most urgent thing. And in fact, we're noticing that organizations are beginning to only want trilinguals working within the bounds of their organization. So this is at the core of how I think we can navigate this new world. If we were to zoom out again, I have a question for you. Is the world becoming a better place or a worse place? If you look at CNN, or in fact any other news agency, by the way, we did. We literally went on CNN and we looked around. We noticed that 98% of all news reported on CNN is negative. 98%. And it's not unique to CNN. You find this on Fox News, on Al Jazeera, on BBC, you name it. What's happening? The modern news cycle is feeding the amygdala, a tiny part of our brains that evolved over thousands of years to over-index on threats. So we pay, by one estimate, 10 times more attention to negative news than positive news. And this is what public media is now exploiting. A colleague of mine, Dr. Peter Diamandis, refers to CNN as the constant negative news, CNN. But is the world becoming a worse place or a better place? Let me share some anecdotes that might change your mind. In the last 50 years, famine deaths globally have plummeted by 2 orders of magnitude. Newborn deaths today have halved worldwide, regardless of the level of income. High income, middle income, and low income countries. Global suicide rates have fallen by 1/3. There have never been more female CEOs as we have today. We definitely need more, but upward mobility for women, for minorities, is on the rise. Tuberculosis deaths worldwide are falling exponentially. Armies everywhere have been shrinking. Violent crime in the United States has halved since 1995, a mere 26 years ago. African countries are squashing malaria. In every single region, we're seeing this. Every type of cancer is seeing survival rates rising. And everything that kills children is declining, from respiratory diseases all the way to AIDS. Ladies and gentlemen, none of these breakthroughs would have been possible without the public sector. I want us to pause for a second and reflect on gratitude. The gratitude we feel to be able to serve. The gratitude we feel for living in a world, in a period of human history, with unprecedented progress for humankind. What are you grateful for right now? Perhaps close your eyes, take some deep breaths. Think about one idea you're grateful for at this moment. Thank you. So, to summarize, let's bring it home. The 7 ideas I wanted to share with you for adaptive governance in an exponential world. I think it comes down to the following. Leveraging digital twins, trilingual employees, empowering them, delivering performance, moving away from delivering services to delivering outcomes and performance, reversing the great disconnect. First of all, acknowledging it and then reversing it, empowering citizens, empowering staff to do more, to do better, to do more with less, celebrating high AQ work whenever you see it. We get what we celebrate. We also get what we tolerate. Let's not tolerate the great disconnect. Let's celebrate high AQ work and bigger goals, better dreams. Goals are dreams with deadlines. Most of us dream, but the moment you have a deadline, it turns into a goal. I want to go back to the story of Richard Fosbury. We started with his inspiring story. But consider this. It took 6 years after his gold medal for the governing body of the sport to admit that his technique was in fact better. It took them 6 years to unlearn. It turns out unlearning is hard. When you move faster with your adaptability and agility, I want to invite you to be kind to others. It might take them a little while to figure out what you're doing. Truth is, today, our reach exceeds our imagination, ladies and gentlemen. The biggest risk today is not thinking big enough. This is your Fosbury moment. What would you do? I want you to picture you're attending Accelerate 2030. What will you hear about at Accelerate 2030? Which of your bold new projects will they be talking about? The time is now. I want to finish with my favorite quote of all time. But first, as I promised, if you want to grab one of those 25 sponsored AQ Boost seats, this is the link to go to, adaptability.org/VIP/Excella. And if you'd like to keep in touch with me, this is my personal email address. I would love to hear from you. My favorite quote of all time. Intelligence is hitting a target that nobody else can. Genius is hitting a target that nobody else can see. When you go out there, when you try to think outside the box, recognize that for a while, people are not going to understand what you're trying to do. They're not even going to see the target you're trying to hit. But if you stay with it, the genius will be revealed. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for the gift of your attention. Thank you. All the best.